official recently returned from Taiwan, he brought back more than impressions of landscapes and meetings. He brought a set of questions that go to the heart of Manila's security calculus. Questions about how states with constrained formal ties nonetheless find ways to cooperate in the face of growing regional uncertainty. He began by making a point that shapes everything that follows. He said, "There is no such thing because we have a one China policy in the Philippines. So we abide by it." Those 7 words, halting in delivery but absolute in meaning, set the boundary for what the Philippines will and will not do when it comes to Taiwan. Formal political and military alliances are off the table. That reality, however, does not close the door on all interaction. It simply forces diplomacy and security cooperation into other channels, economic links, law enforcement collaboration, and a careful pragmatic exchange of information. Where formal military cooperation is precluded, other kinds of cooperation can be surprisingly consequential. The official laid out an urgent, practical agenda, learning from Taiwan's experience resisting malign influence. He warned that interference does not always look like tanks or ships. They could influence through their trolls, information operations, United Front works, he said. And in those things that China is doing, I believe we can exchange information and try to determine courses of action, how to counter those activities of China. This is a crucial point. In contested spaces where kinetic conflict is a risk, the first line of defense for many democracies is often the integrity of information and institutions. Disinformation campaigns, covert influence networks, and online harassment can erode public trust, complicate policy making, and create openings for strategic coercion. For a neighbor like the Philippines, which both shares waters with Taiwan and maintains a large diaspora there, mutual awareness and shared countermeasures can be vital even if formal alliances are off the table. That diaspora is central to the discussion. He raised the human stakes plainly. There are around 150,000 Filipinos in Taiwan. Whether the true figure is somewhat higher or lower, the point is unmistakable. Hundreds of thousands of lives and livelihoods could be directly affected by a sudden escalation across the Taiwan Strait. That reality pushes preparedness into the realm of national interest. It also suggests an area where Manila and Taipei might work together without crossing the red line of military-to-military cooperation. On the subject of contingency planning, the official was careful and clear-eyed. He said, because we cannot cooperate military to military, we can cooperate through humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And I believe a non-combatant evacuation operation could be a start or an entry point for us to cooperate. The phrase non-combatant evacuation operation, neo and defense parlance, is significant. It connotes coordinated logistics, diplomatic channels for repatriation, and rehearsed procedures to move civilians safely in extreme circumstances. It is not an act of aggression, it is crisis management. He framed the conversation in professional, almost clinical terms. For me and my background as military, it's better to be prepared. It's not really being alarmist, or it's not really being instigating something. But to prepare for crisis, to mitigate its effects. Crisis management, basically the principle is to prevent or mitigate the loss of lives and properties. That sentence captures the ethos that informs many defense-minded officials across the region. Planning in this view is not provocation, it is prudence. The discussion then moved from bilateral worries about evacuation and information warfare to a broader regional choreography, multilateral exercises, and the growing visibility of partners in the PP, Philippines security space. This year's Balikatan exercises, the long-running US-Philippine joint drills, have taken on new features. They are no longer a bilateral rehearsal between two partners. They have become a platform where like-minded countries test interoperability, send signals of deterrence, and show up in numbers. Well, I'm not privy to this current Balikatan, he said, but I can share my experience on the previous Balikatan. I believe it matters as an activity to deter a China aggression. It's a matter of deterrence, okay? Cooperation among these countries, if China will see it, then they would see that the Philippines is not alone in this issue. Listen to that phrase, it's a matter of deterrence. For many policymakers in Manila, the presence of other nations, even as observers, even in limited roles, changes the strategic arithmetic. Exercises that once focused on humanitarian assistance or counter-terrorism increasingly include complex joint force scenarios, live-fire drills, and maritime interoperability tasks that are relevant to a range of contingencies. That expansion of participants also reflects Manila's effort to broaden its partnerships without surrendering sovereignty. In recent years, allies and partners have deepened ties through training exchanges, capacity building, and legal frameworks that permit visiting forces to operate more easily. For the Philippines, bringing more countries into routine defense activities signals two things. First, the country is strengthening its own capabilities. Second is weaving a denser network of external ties that complicates any potential coercive move by a third party. Japan's role deserves special attention in this evolving landscape. The official traced its trajectory in a measured way. Well, I think the activities of Japan right now have been planned before. It has been concretized because of the RAA. When I was still in the active duty, we have already said engagement with the conflict, engagement with Japan. The RAA, the Reciprocal Access Agreement, is shorthand for an institutional shift. Agreements of this kind standardize the rules that govern the presence and activities of foreign forces on sovereign territory. They make cooperation predictable and legalistic, rather than ad hoc. He added a concrete note about Japan's presence in exercises. First, they were observers before. But now I believe they executed the plan of them participating full force here in the Philippines. That change, moving from observer status to boots on the ground, reflects broader changes in Tokyo's posture and in the architecture of regional defense cooperation. For Manila, deepening interoperability with a major regional power through legal frameworks, combined training, and shared logistics enhances its ability to respond to crises while leaving room for diplomacy. Across these conversations runs a simple through line. The Philippines is balancing NG constraints with necessities, the One China policy limits formal defense ties with Taiwan, but it does not compel Manila to ignore practical vulnerabilities that could affect its citizens and its security. Economic engagement, law enforcement cooperation, crisis planning, and information sharing become the toolkit for dealing with cross-strait instability. At the same time, expanding partnerships through exercises like Balikatan and reciprocal agreements with other democracies creates strategic depth that complicates potential coercion. There is also an ethical dimension to this approach. Preparation and deterrence. In the account he offered are framed as acts of stewardship over lives and property. Crisis management, basically the principle is to prevent or mitigate the loss of lives and properties, he said. That is not rhetoric. It is a working definition of the role of defense institutions in a democracy to protect citizens, whether at home or abroad. The existence of a large Filipino community in Taiwan makes that protection cross-border by necessity. Repatriation plans, evacuation rehearsals, and humanitarian coordination are therefore not a matter of military posturing, but a basic expression of state responsibility. Yet preparation raises tough political and diplomatic questions. Where does prudent readiness end and provocative signaling begin? How does a state reassure its own public without escalating tensions with a more powerful neighbor? The official's answer rests on distinctions that are both legal and normative. Military-to-military cooperation with Taiwan is off-limits under the One China policy. But humanitarian cooperation and non-combatant evacuation planning fall into a different category, one that is defensible as neutral, civil and protective rather than aggressive. There is an operational challenge as well. Planning a safe, orderly evacuation of tens of thousands of civilians across a volatile theatre requires airlift capacity, port access, clear documentation procedures, and diplomatic lines of communication. It requires tabletop drills, clear chains of command, and contingency plans for the worst-case scenarios. All of that can be done without formal defense ties. It simply requires will, resources, and sustained intergovernmental coordination. Information operations are a different kind of puzzle. The official described them in blunt terms: trolls. Information operations, united front works, and urged a pragmatic response, exchange intelligence, develop countermeasures, and coordinate courses of action. That is again where Taiwan's recent experience is valuable to the Philippines. Taipei has invested heavily in countering foreign influence and in hardening its information space. Those lessons are portable and often apolitical. For democracies that prize free expression, the challenge is to strike a balance between resilience against malign campaigns and respect for civil liberties. As the interview ran, Dead back to strategy and deterrence, one phrase underscored the larger calculus: cooperation among the Philippines and its partners is meant to ensure that the Philippines is not alone in this issue. Alliances and partnerships in this reading are about density, not necessarily formal defense pacts, but a web of predictable interactions that raise the political and military costs of coercion. Exercises, visiting force arrangements, reciprocal access agreements, and joint training all contribute to that density. Finally, the official return to a simple, personal rationale. Having come from a military background, he said preparedness is not alarmism, it is a professional obligation. He emphasized a humane aim to reduce casualties, to secure livelihoods, and to keep citizens safe. That is the through line tying together seemingly disparate threads: disinformation, evacuation plans, humanitarian cooperation, multinational exercises, and legal agreements. They are all components of a strategy meant to preserve life and national agency in a region that is changing rapidly. The takeaway is both practical and strategic. On the practical side, the Philippines and Taiwan can and should deepen exchanges on humanitarian preparedness and countering malign influence, even as political constraints limit formal military ties. On the strategic side, expanding multilateral participation in exercises and deepening legal frameworks with partners like Japan broaden Manila's options for deterrence without necessarily pushing it into irreversible commitments. In the end, the conversation he described is less about grand strategy than about daily stewardship. It is about officials waking up to new risks, running through checklists, and trying to ensure that governments can respond when, not if, crises arise. It's better to be prepared, he said plainly. That is a modest claim. But modesty can be powerful when it is backed by concrete planning, clear-eyed diplomacy, and a will, ingenious to work across fronts that are political, informational, and humanitarian. This is a story of linnets and ingenuity. Where formal ties are constrained by doctrine and diplomacy, states find other roads to cooperation. Where regional tensions threaten to displace ordinary lives, officials search for practical remedies that can be executed without inflaming a volatile situation. In that space, technical, legal, and human, the work of preparation goes on. It is, in the words he offered, the work of preventing or mitigating loss. And for communities with family and livelihoods on both sides of a contested strait, that work is urgent, necessary, and ultimately humane.